It seems I repeat myself. I begin many of these episodes by talking about new introductions to the war, a new front, a new weapon, a new strategy, but impossibly, the war, with a death toll now in the millions, still grows larger day by day, as this week, Canadian troops really show their skills for the first time, and the Germans begin the regular use of poison gas. I'm Indy Nidell. This is The Great War. Last week, the war in the air had grown, with both sides bombing each other by Zeppelin and airplane. The Russians were still unable to force the Austro-Hungarian army, now reinforced by German troops, back in the Carpathians. Italy was considering joining the Allies, and the British held their ground in Mesopotamia. It's interesting that the war in the air was a hot topic last week, because this week now saw the war underground develop at the Battle of Hill 60. The battle lasted from the 17th of April to the 22nd, and it was launched when the British set off an explosion of mines underneath the German positions on the relatively high ground of Hill 60, southeast of Ypres. This was actually the first time the British Army had laid mines beneath an enemy position to blow them out of their defenses. The fighting was pretty fierce, but the British managed to capture the hill. Now, on April 19th, British Commander-in-Chief John French denied a rumor that the British had used poison gas at Hill 60. This is interesting because his opponents, the Germans, most definitely did use poison gas in the first large-scale, successful gas attack of the war a few days later on April 22nd, as they attacked the Allies to begin the Second Battle of Ypres. The first attack came at around 5 p.m. against French, Algerian, and territorial troops. 168 tons of chlorine gas was released by the Germans along a front nearly 7 kilometers wide, and a greenish-yellow mist rolled across the land toward the French positions. The gas struck with devastating effect. Within minutes, the French colonials had suffered some 6,000 casualties, either dying of asphyxiation or tissue damage to the lungs, or being blinded, since the chlorine destroys soft tissues like lungs and eyes. Now, the gas was heavier than air, so it settled in the French positions, and anyone escaping the gas was in the line of fire. So the first attack was incredibly effective, and soldiers were forced to run for their lives, opening a hole over 1 kilometer long in the line. But the Germans didn't really exploit their sudden and striking success, partly because it had been an experimental attack, and they weren't prepared for it to work so well, so they hadn't planned on taking the whole Ypres salient, which they may very well have been able to do. But many of their reserves had been transported to the Eastern Front to fight the Russians. Still though, the German advance slowly came on. Canadian troops came up to defend the flank of the break in the lines, taking heavy casualties by being attacked on 3 sides, but holding on. And then, at Kitchener's Wood, another Canadian battalion counterattacked just before midnight. They used makeshift respirators like cloths covered in urine to protect their faces, and advancing without reconnaissance and eventually charging with bayonets, managed to drive the Germans from their positions, but at a casualty rate reported as high as 75%. Although Canadian troops had fought at Neuve-Chapelle a few weeks earlier, this was the first major engagement by Canadian troops in the war, and they fought exceptionally well, especially considering the terror of the poison gas. Actually, years later, Ferdinand Foch, at this time a French general, would remark that the Canadian charge on Kitchener's Wood was the greatest act of the entire war. At dawn on the 24th, the Germans attacked again, with another cloud rolling ahead, this time toward the Canadians at Saint-Julien. Though better prepared for the gas this time, it was still another horror story. And though again they fought impressively, they were pushed back all along their line. In just 48 hours, the Canadians took total casualties of 1 man in every 3. Actually, there were troops from all over the world fighting the Second Battle of Ypres. On the 25th, 15,000 British and Indian troops went into action with yellow flags flying. Seriously. They were to show their position to the British artillery, right? But they also showed it to the Germans. The day earlier, General Smith-Darien had asked Commander French not to order any further attacks because of a disastrous attempt across no man's land where his men were just chopped to pieces, but no dice. The attack went ahead, and when the Germans released gas again, it went haywire, with some French colonial troops shooting their own officers for trying to make them advance into the gas. However, the Germans also experienced big problems combining an infantry attack with the gas. There were the issues with winds dispersing or blowing back the gas towards their own lines. And of course, now that everyone could have at least a makeshift respirator, its effectiveness was not nearly what it had been during the initial attack, and the immediate danger was over. Actually, there were other troops from the far-flung corners of the British Empire gathering this week, expecting to soon see action further to the southeast, where, throughout March and April, Australian and New Zealander forces, Anzacs, were being assembled for an assault on Gallipoli. However, the Turks were also busy there. Labour battalions had been frantically rebuilding the forts and the defences of the peninsula with the aid of 500 German officers and troops. Actually, only 4 of the Ottoman divisions on the peninsula were Ottoman-led. The other 2 had German commanders. Barbed wire was laid where landings might take place. Machine gun nests were installed. When an Allied landing finally happened, it would be no picnic. The Turks weren't the only ones worried about an invasion, though. Throughout the month, Austro-Hungarian Army Chief of Staff Konrad von Hotzendorf was worried about what Italy was going to do. The Italians, who'd had an alliance with Austria and Germany before the war, were now demanding huge chunks of Austrian territory to remain neutral, and were even considering joining the Allies in the struggle. If they did, what would Konrad do, given that as many troops as possible were desperately needed to keep the Russians at bay in the Carpathian Mountains, and the troops he proposed to deploy to a theoretical Italian front would most likely not be enough to hold back an Italian army hundreds of thousands strong? Konrad insisted that only a new combined Austro-German offensive against the Russians could relieve the pressure and allow him to consider the Italian question. Konrad believing that Italian military intervention could decide the war. German Army Chief of Staff Falkenhayn, to Konrad's surprise, agreed and began transferring German troops to the east to prepare for a massive assault. And a smaller assault was underway this week in eastern Anatolia, where Turkish forces surrounded and set siege to the city of Van. Within the city were 1,300 armed Armenian fighters and 30,000 civilians. Also at this time, tens of thousands of Armenians were being deported from Erzurum over the mountains into Mesopotamia, and further south, by April 20th, the deportation of 25,000 Armenians from Zaytun was complete. Almost every continent on Earth was involved actively in the war this week, and there was even a fair amount of fighting in Africa. Union forces under Colonel Van de Venter advanced in German southwest Africa, occupying Seeheim April 18th and taking Keetmanshoop on the 20th. Further to the north, Anglo-French troops took Mandera in Cameroon. So that's where we stand at the end of the week. The British attacking the Germans beneath the ground, the Germans effectively using poison gas, and the Canadians grimly taking them on. Both the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires concerned with being invaded. The Germans losing more and more territory in Africa, but preparing to try and make it up with Russian territory. And the war grows larger and larger as troops from all over the world begin to make their appearances. The Canadians this week surprising everybody with their unexpected skill and perseverance. But you know, we've seen troops from every warring nation exhibiting enormous courage, even or especially when their leaders led them straight into disaster. And that would continue. And whether victorious or not, whether routing the enemy or facing catastrophe, whether facing a wall of machine guns or clouds of poison gas, the great sadness is that the best of the men, the bravest and best of the soldiers, those with hearts of lions from whatever nation, would be the first to die, and would die in the greatest of numbers. In early 1915, this sacrifice was especially gruesome. Both in the Carpathians and in the Caucasus, men were dying, sent to death in the thousands by leaders not in touch with reality. Check out our episode from week 24 of the war right here. For more stories of World War I, follow us on Facebook, and if you like our show, tell your friends, your kids, your neighbors, your relatives all about us, and subscribe. See you next time.